October 19, 1941. The air smelled like burning wheat and diesel fuel. Dmitry Volkov lay face down in a ditch somewhere east of Vyazma, his cheek pressed against cold mud that tasted of iron and ash. His ears rang from the Stuka dive that had torn his unit apart 20 minutes ago. Above him, German voices barked orders he couldn't understand, but their meaning was clear enough. He was alive. That realization came slowly, like blood returning to a sleeping limb. His rifle was gone. So was Ivan, the farm boy from Kursk who'd shared his last cigarette that morning. Dmitry didn't look for Ivan's body. He already knew. Boots crunched closer. Dmitry's fingers dug into the earth, but there was nowhere left to run. The forests around Vyazma had become a graveyard for the Red Army's Western Front. Over 500,000 men encircled. Cut off. Starving. He'd heard the whispers in the trenches before the line collapsed. They're shooting prisoners, but whispers didn't matter anymore when German rifle barrels pressed against your spine. Aufstehen! The command came with a kick to his ribs. Dmitry rolled over, blinking against October sunlight that felt too bright for the end of the world. A Wehrmacht soldier stood over him, young, maybe 20, with dust coating his field-gray uniform and something tired living behind his eyes. Not cruel, just empty. Dmitry raised his hands. Around him, hundreds of other Soviet soldiers emerged from ditches, forests, and burned-out farmhouses. Some limped, others crawled. Most walked with the blank expression of men who'd already died inside. They formed ragged columns along a dirt road cratered by artillery. No one spoke. Speaking required energy they didn't have. The march began without ceremony. West. Always west. Away from Moscow. Away from home. Dmitry's boots, what remained of them, left bloody prints in the dust. His tunic hung open, where shrapnel had torn through the fabric near his shoulder. The wound wasn't deep, but it had bled enough to glue his undershirt to his skin. Every step pulled at the scab. He focused on that pain. It meant he was still human. Still something more than the walking corpses shuffling beside him. By the second day, the column had swelled to thousands. Soviet POWs from shattered divisions, tank crews without tanks, pilots who'd bailed from burning yaks. They merged into a slow river of khaki and exhaustion that stretched for kilometers. German guards flanked them on motorcycles and trucks, rifles ready, but they rarely needed to shoot. Where would anyone run? The entire front had collapsed. Russia felt further away than the moon. Dmitry learned the rhythm of captivity quickly. Walk, don't fall, don't look the guards in the eye, share nothing, trust no one. The men who talked too much disappeared at night. So did the men who looked too strong, too defiant, or wore the wrong insignia. Political officers, commissars, Jews. The Germans had lists. On the third day, an old sergeant from Leningrad whispered to Dmitry during a rest stop. His name was Pyotr, and his beard had gone white despite being maybe 40 years old. "They're taking us to camps," Pyotr said, his voice like gravel scraping tin. "In Poland, maybe Germany. I heard the guards talking." "What kind of camps?" Dmitry asked. Pyotr just looked at him. The answer sat in his eyes like a stone at the bottom of a well. That night, Dmitry dreamed of bread. Not the dense black bread his mother used to bake in their village near Smolensk, but any bread. Even sawdust bread. Even moldy bread. His stomach had stopped hurting 2 days ago. That scared him more than the pain had. Before we continue with Dmitry's story, make sure you're subscribed. These forgotten voices deserve to be heard. November 2nd, 1941. The train had no seats, no windows you could see through. Just wooden slats and darkness and the smell of 200 unwashed men pressed together like cargo. Dmitry stood because there was no room to sit. His legs had gone numb somewhere past the Polish border, but numbness was mercy. The man beside him had died that morning, but there was nowhere for the body to fall. It rode with them, held upright by the crowd, eyes half open. When the doors finally screeched open, winter air hit Dmitry's face like a slap. He stumbled onto a railway platform surrounded by barbed wire and watchtowers. Pine trees pressed close on all sides, dark and silent under low November clouds, somewhere in Germany, maybe Poland. Geography had stopped mattering. Stalag 4BB. The name meant nothing to Dmitri then. Later, he would learn it was one of hundreds of camps built to hold the endless flood of Soviet prisoners. Later, he would learn that most of those prisoners would never leave. But that afternoon, shivering on the platform while German guards shouted and dogs barked, all Dmitri knew was cold and the strange quiet that settled over captured men. They marched through the gates in rows of 5, past coiled wire, past guard posts, past wooden barracks that stretched in perfect lines toward a treeless horizon. The camp was huge, bigger than his entire village, and it was already full. Thousands of Soviet POWs stood in formation in the central yard, skeletal men in rotting uniforms who watched the new arrivals with eyes that held neither hope nor pity. An officer in a crisp Wehrmacht uniform climbed onto a platform. He spoke German, then Russian, translated by a collaborator whose accent marked him as Ukrainian. The speech was brief. "You are prisoners of the Third Reich. You will work. You will obey. You will receive rations according to your labor. Those who refuse to work will not eat. Those who attempt to escape will be shot." That was all. No mention of the Geneva Convention, no promise of letters home or Red Cross parcels. The rules here were simple: work or die. Dmitri was assigned to Barracks 14. The building was raw timber, unheated, with 3-tiered wooden bunks lining both walls. He counted 60 men in a space meant for 30. Most lay motionless under thin blankets, conserving whatever calories they had left. No one spoke. Speaking burns energy. His bunk was middle tier, near the door. The boards had no mattress, just a layer of straw that smelled like mice and mildew. Dmitri lay down and stared at the bunk above him. Someone had carved Cyrillic letters into the wood. Vasily, Kiev, still alive. The date beside it read August 1941. 3 months ago. Dmitri wondered if Vasily was still alive. He wondered if he would be alive in 3 months. That night, the bread came. A guard entered the barracks carrying a wooden crate. He dumped 6 loaves onto a table near the door and left without a word. 6 loaves for 60 men. Dark bread. German army bread. Real bread. The barracks erupted. Men surged forward, weak limbs suddenly filled with desperate strength. Dmitri stayed on his bunk. He'd seen this before, in the column. The men who fought over scraps died faster than those who waited. Emotion was expensive. When the frenzy ended, Dmitri climbed down. A few crumbs remained on the table. He scraped them into his palm with a fingernail and ate them slowly, letting each grain dissolve on his tongue. It tasted like heaven and sawdust and survival. Pyotr, the old sergeant from the march, sat on a bunk nearby. He'd gotten a piece the size of a thumb. He broke it in half and handed one piece to Dmitri. "You didn't fight," Pyotr said. "Neither did you. That's how you live here. You learn to wait. You learn to become invisible." He chewed slowly, eyes distant. "The Germans don't see us as soldiers, not even as men. We're labor, tools. If you work, you eat. If you can't work, you disappear." "Disappear where?" Pyotr didn't answer. He just bit into his bread and closed his eyes. December 19th, 1941. Snow fell in thick curtains over the work detail. Dmitri swung a pickaxe into frozen ground beside a half-built road that stretched toward nowhere. His hands were wrapped in strips of cloth torn from a dead man's tunic. His boots had holes in both soles. His breath came in clouds that froze on his beard. Around him, 200 Soviet POWs worked in silence, chipping at earth that rang like iron. Guards watched from the roadside, rifles slung, cigarettes glowing. They didn't need to shout anymore. Everyone understood. You worked until you dropped or until the shift ended. Those were the only 2 options. Dmitri had learned the rules. Move slow but steady. Never stop completely. Never look like you're resting. The guards shot men who rested. He'd seen it happen. A boy from Minsk who'd collapsed near the gravel pile. The shot had echoed across the worksite like a branch snapping. The boy's body stayed where it fell until evening, a warning written in snow and blood. The work details ran from dawn to dusk. Road building, ditch digging, hauling timber, clearing rubble in bombed-out towns. The Germans needed laborers more than they needed soldiers, and Soviet POWs cost nothing. No wages, no rights. Just bread and soup and the promise of another day. But the bread kept coming. That was the strange part, the impossible part. Every evening, when the work details staggered back through the gates, the bread was waiting. Not much, sometimes only a quarter loaf per man, but it was there, consistent, real. Dmitri didn't understand it. He'd heard the rumors from the older prisoners, men who'd been captured in the summer. They said the camps near Moscow had no bread, no food at all. Men eating grass, eating bark, eating each other. They said the Germans wanted the Soviet prisoners to die. It was policy, orders from Berlin. So why the bread? He asked Pyotr one night in the barracks. The old sergeant sat on his bunk, rubbing circulation back into his fingers. Frostbite had claimed his left pinky. The flesh had turned black and fallen off 3 days ago. It's economics, Pyotr said. They need us for labor. Dead men don't build roads, so they feed us just enough to keep working. Not enough to get strong, just enough to not die. But the Wehrmacht bread is real bread. Better than what we ate in the Red Army. Exactly. Pyotr's voice was flat. That's the cruelty of it. They show you what civilization looks like, what the order looks like. Then they work you until your body breaks anyway. It's more efficient than bullets. Dmitri thought about that. He thought about the bread. He thought about the men who died beside him despite the bread, from exhaustion, from disease, from cold, from wounds that wouldn't heal. The bread wasn't mercy. It was maintenance, like oiling a machine. But it was still bread. By January, Dmitri had developed the 1,000-yard stare common to long-term prisoners. His body moved on autopilot during work details. His mind drifted elsewhere, to his village, to his mother's kitchen, to the girl he'd kissed once behind the church before the war. Her name was Katya. He wondered if she was still alive. He wondered if she thought he was dead. One afternoon, a new transport arrived, fresh POWs from the Moscow front, where the Wehrmacht offensive had finally stalled in the winter. These men looked different, less defeated. They still had fire in their eyes. They whispered about Soviet counterattacks, about German retreats, about Stalin's order. Not one step back. Hope was dangerous in the camps. Dmitri had learned that. Hope made you careless, made you forget that survival required numbness. But listening to the new prisoners, something flickered in his chest that he'd thought was dead. Maybe the war wasn't over. Maybe the Red Army was still fighting. Maybe someday this will end. That night, the bread ration increased. A full half-loaf per man. No explanation. Just more bread. Dmitri ate his portion slowly, one crumb at a time, and let himself imagine tomorrow, March 7th, 1942. Spring came slowly to the camp. Snow melted into black mud that swallowed boots and turned the yard into a swamp. The barracks smelled like rot and fever. Dysentery had swept through Barracks 14, claiming 8 men in 2 weeks. Their bunks were refilled immediately. There were always more prisoners. Dmitri had survived the winter, barely. His ribs showed through his skin like piano keys. His gums bled when he chewed. His joints ached in ways that made him feel 60 instead of 23. But he was alive. That counted for something. The work details had shifted with the season. Now they were building infrastructure for the German war effort, repairing railway lines bombed by Soviet partisans, constructing warehouses for military supplies. The pace was faster. The guards are more aggressive. Germany needed every resource for the Eastern Front, where the Wehrmacht was preparing a new summer offensive. Dmitri worked on a railway detail near the camp. His job was hauling wooden ties from a supply yard to the track bed. Each tie weighed 40 kilograms. He carried them in pairs with another prisoner, A kid from Kharkov named Alexei who couldn't have been more than 19. They didn't talk much. Talking required the breath they needed for lifting. One afternoon, Alexei collapsed. They were halfway between the supply yard and the tracks when his legs just folded. The tie hit the ground. So did Alexei. He lay in the mud, gasping, eyes unfocused. A guard shouted from the roadside, "Aufstehen!" Dmitri knelt beside Alexei. "Get up. Come on, get up." But Alexei couldn't. His body had nothing left. Dmitri could see it in his face, that look prisoners got when they'd burned through their last reserves, when the bread wasn't enough anymore. The guard approached, rifle unslung. Dmitri stood and stepped between them. He didn't plan it. I didn't think about the consequences. His body just moved. "He can work," Dmitri said in broken German. "Give him a minute, he can work." The guard looked at Dmitri like he was an insect. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the guard spat in the mud and walked away. Dmitri hauled Alexei to his feet. Together, slower now, they carried the tie to the tracks. Alexei didn't thank him. Thanks were expensive. But that night in the barracks, Alexei gave Dmitri half his bread ration. Pyotr watched from his bunk, eyes unreadable. "You took a risk today," Pyotr said later, after lights out. "He would have died. Maybe. Or maybe you would have died instead. The guards don't like heroes." "I'm not a hero. I just—" Dmitri stopped. He didn't know how to explain it. The numbness that kept him alive was also killing him. Becoming invisible meant forgetting he was human, forgetting he'd once had a name, a home, a reason to survive beyond just surviving. "The bread keeps us alive," Pyotr said quietly, "but it also keeps us docile, grateful. The Germans know that. They feed us just enough to stop us from fighting back. It's brilliant, really. Cruelty, dressed up as civilization." Dmitri thought about that. He thought about the half-loaf Alexei had given him, and the strange calculus of camp life, where tiny acts of kindness carried the weight of miracles. "Do you think we'll ever leave here?" Dmitri asked. Pyotr was silent for a long time. Then, "I don't know, but if we do, we have to remember. Someone has to remember that we were men, not just numbers, not just labor. Men." May 9, 1945. The war ended on a Tuesday. Dmitri learned about it 3 days later when Allied trucks rolled through the camp gates and British soldiers started tearing down the barbed wire. He stood in the yard with 1,000 other Soviet POWs, blinking in spring sunshine, trying to understand that it was over. 4 years. He'd been a prisoner for 4 years. The British gave them real food, chocolate, canned meat, fresh bread different from German bread, softer, whiter, strange. Dmitri's stomach rejected it the first time. His body didn't remember how to process richness. Pyotr wasn't there to see liberation. He died in February of 1943 of lung infection in the bunk above Dmitri's. Alexei from Kharkov had died too, typhus, winter of 1944. Most of the men Dmitri had known in Barracks 14 were gone. New faces had cycled through, new ghosts. The British asked questions, took names, tried to organize transport home, but home was complicated for Soviet POWs. Stalin had declared that surrender was treason. Rumors spread through the camp returning prisoners were being sent to the Gulag, punishment for surviving when they should have died fighting. Dmitri didn't know what to believe. He only knew he needed to see Russia again, to walk the fields near Smolensk, to find out if his mother was still alive, if Katya had waited, if anything of his old life remained. He crossed the Soviet border in July, packed into a cattle car with 200 other former POWs. They were taken to a filtration camp, interrogated, investigated for collaboration, for treason, for weakness. The questions lasted weeks. The bread they gave him was black bread, coarse, familiar, Soviet bread. It tasted like ash and home. They released him in September, with papers stamping him politically unreliable. He couldn't join the party, couldn't work certain jobs, couldn't speak openly about his captivity without risking arrest. The war had ended, but his imprisonment hadn't. Not really. Dmitri made it back to Smolensk in October, exactly 4 years after his capture. His village was rubble. His mother's house was gone, burned in 1941 during the German advance. Neighbors told him she'd died that first winter. Starvation, same as millions of others. Katya had married an officer in 1943. She has 2 children now. Dmitri saw her once, across the street in town. She didn't recognize him. He'd lost 30 kilograms. His hair had gone gray at 27. He looked like a stranger. He never told anyone the whole truth about the camp, about the bread that kept him alive, about the cruelty hidden inside that mercy, about becoming invisible to survive and the cost of invisibility. In Stalin's Russia, survival was suspicious. Better to stay quiet, better to forget. But late at night, when sleep wouldn't come, Dmitri remembered. He remembered Pyotr's white beard and tired wisdom. He remembered Alexei's half-ration of bread, given without words. He remembered the taste of German army bread and how it kept him alive just long enough to be broken. He remembered that he'd been a man once, before the war taught him how to be a ghost. The bread had been real. The hunger had been real. The dying had been real. And so had the living, somehow, despite everything designed to crush it. Dmitri Volkov lived until 1993. He worked in a factory, married late, had no children. He never spoke about the war, not even to his wife. But sometimes she'd catch him staring at bread on their kitchen table, his expression unreadable, lost in a place she couldn't follow. The stories of men like Dmitri are rarely told, overshadowed by battles and generals, forgotten in the vast machinery of history. But their survival, stubborn, silent, scarred, was its own kind of victory. A refusal to be erased. If this story moved you, subscribe for more untold chapters of World War II history. Comment below and share where you're watching from. Let's prove these stories still echo across the world.